Section 7 of Abe and Mawruss. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit Librivox.org. Abe and Mawruss. Being Further Adventures of Potash and Perlmutter by Montague Glass. Chapter 5. A Return to Arcady, Part 2. When Mawruss returned to his place of business that afternoon, he had packed Sam Green off to his store upstate with instructions to return in a week, during which Mawruss hoped to take the matter up with Abe. As for his hour-long absence from his place of business, Mawruss had provided himself with a plausible explanation in rebuttal to the quiet, ironical greeting that he knew would await him. His program was a little upset, however, by Abe's inquiry, which was not in the least ironical. "Loafer, where you been?" Abe demanded. "What do you mean, loafer?" Mawruss cried. "I mean, while you are fooling away your time, Mo Greaseman comes in here to see us, and naturally he don't find none of us here, so he goes away again. From us he goes straight over to Sammet Brothers, and that's the way it goes." "But Abe," Mawruss protested, "I thought you told me he cancels his order this morning and buys only from Klinger and Klein." "Sure, I know," Abe said, "but I suppose he finds out he couldn't find all the goods he wants with one concern, and now he goes over to Sammet Brothers." "How do you know he went over to Sammet Brothers?" Mawruss asked. "A question. How do I know it?" Abe exclaimed. "Ain't he left a memorandum I should ring him up there?" "Well, why don't you ring him up and find out what he wants?" Mawruss retorted. "What do I care what he wants, Mawruss?" Abe rejoined. "Whatever he wants, he don't want it now, because them two cutthroats would suck him dry of orders. Once a fella gets into the hands of Sammet Brothers, they won't let him go till he bought himself blue in the face." "Ring him up anyhow," Mawruss insisted. And the next moment Abe was engaged in a heated altercation with Central. Finally, he heard Leon Sammet at the other end of the wire. "Hello," he yelled. "I want to speak with Mr. Greaseman." "Never mind what I want to speak to him about. That's my business." "I ain't the fresh one. You're the fresh one. You're asking me something which you ain't got no right to ask me at all. You know well enough who it is talking." After 5 minutes' further conversation, Leon relinquished his end of the wire to Greaseman, and immediately thereafter Abe's voice diminished in harshness till it became fairly flute-like with friendship and amiability. "Oh, hello, Mr. Greaseman," he said. "Do you want to talk to me?" "Why, no, Mr. Greaseman. He don't owe us nothing. He paid us this morning. Sure." "What did you want to know for?" "Why should we sell his account, Mr. Greaseman? He's a little slow, you understand, but he's quite good." "That's all right. Goodbye." When he returned to the showroom, his face wore a puzzled expression. "Well, Abe, what did he want?" Mawruss asked. Abe shrugged his shoulders. "I don't know what he's up to, Mawruss," Abe said, "but he tells me he wants to buy from us Sam Green's account. So I told him Sam pays us this morning, and he rings off." "Why should Mo Greaseman want to buy from us Sam Green's account?" Mawruss muttered to himself, and then a wave of recollection came over him. Obviously, it was Mo Greaseman who had bought out Sam's competitors, and this caused Sam's bank to shut down on him. Now Mo Greaseman was attempting to buy up Sam's liabilities and close him up, so that there might be no competitor to Mo's new business in Cyprus. At length, the humor of the situation appealed to Mawruss, and he grinned vacuously at his partner. "No?" Abe growled. "What are you laughing at?" "Nothing much, Abe," Mawruss replied. "I was only thinking, that's all, Abe. I was thinking to myself, Abe, what a joke it would be, supposing, for instance, Sam's check should come back NG." When Sam Green entered the smoker of the 7:30 train from Syracuse to Cyprus the following morning, a well-dressed man of 60 followed him down the aisle and sat down in the same seat with him. Have a cigar? The stranger said. Much obliged, Sam replied as he took it. If it is just the same to you, I would smoke it after dinner. Sure, the stranger rejoined, handing him another. Smoke that one after dinner, and smoke this one now. Sam grinned, and after they had lit up, he ventured the observation that it was fine weather. Aber it should be colder, he concluded, for heavyweights. Oh, are you in the clothing business? The stranger asked. I got a sort of a store, Sam replied. Clothing and cloaks, and suits also. A dry goods store in Cyprus. In Cyprus? Sam's seatmate cried. You don't tell me. I'm going down to Cyprus, too. My fall buying is through, Sam said. I'm not selling goods this trip, the stranger replied. I'm on vacation. A vacation? Sam murmured. In Cyprus? That's a Medina for a vacation. There are worse places than Cyprus, my friend, said Sam's newfound acquaintance. And thereat began a conversation that lasted until the train finally drew into Cyprus. Would you mind telling me what is your name, please? Sam asked as they prepared to leave the car. Certainly, the stranger said, handing his card to Sam. Kirschner, Sam exclaimed, looking at the card. Kirschner von unserer Leute? Sure, Max Kirschner replied. Did your father once run a store under the opera house here? That's right. And after he died, the widow sells out to a man by the name of Marcus Senft? The same one, Max replied. Why do you ask? Because I bought out that fella, Marcus Senft, Sam replied. And I got on my books yet debts which your mother sold to Senft for 25 cents on the dollar, and he sold to me for 10 cents. I'll bet I know who owes him too, Max commented. You could look him over if you want, Sam said, as they started to walk down the hilly lane from the depot to the main street. I will, after I've washed up at the hotel. Hotel, Sam exclaimed. What do you mean hotel? We ain't go to no hotel. You're coming home with me. A fellow von unserer Leute should come to Cyprus for a vacation and stay at a hotel? An idea. He linked his arm in Max's, and together they walked to Sam's store. We'll take a look in here first before we go up to the house, Sam said as he opened the door. The next moment, Sam Green was clasped to the ample bosom of Leah Green, who glanced inquiringly at Max Kirschner. Mama, Sam announced, this is Mr. Max Kirschner, which he ought to be like an old friend on account he was born and raised in this here town, and his father run this very store. Max looked around him at the shelves and showcases. The same fixtures, he muttered absently. He's only in town for a couple of days, Mama, Sam said hesitatingly, so I thought we could easy fix up the spare room, ain't it? Why, sure, Mrs. Green replied as she shook Max's hand warmly. Is the folks all well, Mr. Kirschner? Max smiled sadly. You can judge for yourself, Mrs. Green, he said, because I'm all the folks there are. Oh, sure, Mrs. Green hastened to say. I remember now you never got married. Why, how do you know that? Sam asked. Mrs. Green nodded her head sideways in Sam's direction. You don't never hear nothing, Mr. Kirschner, she said. With me, the women folks schmoozes all the time, and you could take it from me, Mr. Kirschner, they talk a whole lot more about what happens 40 years ago as what happens last week already. Max nodded as the store door opened and a woman of uncertain age entered. Good morning, Miss Green, the newcomer said, her eyes glued on Max Kirschner. I was just passing by on my way to the depot when I remembered that I needed a spool of thread. Mrs. Green passed behind the counter to reach the thread case. Going to Syracuse today, Mr. A? She asked casually. Mrs. Duryea blushed. I'm on my way to see my sister's little granddaughter, she explained. She's just recovering from whooping cough. Would that be your sister Libby? Max inquired. Mrs. Duryea started visibly. I don't know as she began. That's so, Max continued. Libby moved to Elmira. It must be Carrie. She married Lem Peters, didn't she? Well, of all things, Mrs. Duryea exclaimed, who in the world told you all that? I just remembered it, Max said, holding out his hand. How's Tom? Mrs. Duryea took the proffered hand gingerly. He's pretty spry, she said. Tell him Max Kirschner was asking for him, Max replied. You ain't Max Kirschner, Mrs. Duryea cried. Just as sure as you're Haiti Watson, Max said. How are all the children, Haiti? All growed up and flew away, Mrs. Duryea replied. What are you doing around here? Max's eyes twinkled mischievously. I'm selling goods for Mr. Green here, he declared. Let's see, Haiti, 42 bust, I should say. He snatched a garment from a rack nearby. Here's a coat, Haiti, that would stand you in $40 in Syracuse, he said. One of those big dry goods stores there figures on a coat like this. Garment, wholesale, $20. Running a big store with elevators, electric lights, and all modern improvements, $10. Advertising, $5. Profit, $5. Total, $40. We figure here, cost of garment, $20. Store expenses, 50 cents. Profit, $4.50. Total, $25. Put it on, Haiti, and let's see how you look in the garment. Well, I declare, Mrs. Duryea exclaimed, as she allowed herself to be assisted into the garment. You take my breath away. Max stepped back to survey the effect, and if the admiration expressed in his face was simulated, at least the friendliness of his smile was not. Now, Haiti, I want to tell you something, he declared. If anyone would say to me that I went to school with you, I'd think they'd had a bad memory. I'd tell 'em it was your mother that sat next to me in Miss Johnson's room and not you. Mrs. Duryea fairly beamed as she strutted up and down the store. Well, Max, she said at last, let me bring my friend Miss Williams in this afternoon, and we'll decide on it then. But I thought you were going to Syracuse, Max rejoined. I was, Mrs. Duryea said, as she started to leave, but I ain't now. The news of Max Kirschner's return spread through Cyprus like a brush fire, and 20 minutes after Mrs. Duryea had left Sam Green's store, Max was holding a levee behind the old counter. By 2 o'clock, he had greeted over 50 old friends, and at least 20 of them had made purchases in amounts varying from $5 to $30. As sure as you're standing there, Mr. Kirschner, Sam declared, I sold more goods this morning as in the last 2 months. Max grinned delightedly. His face was flushed, and he looked at least 10 years younger as he patted Sam on the shoulder. Look out for the rush this afternoon, he said. If we only had a better assortment, Green, I think we could keep this up for a week longer, and after that we could do a good steady business. We? Sam exclaimed. Max colored and smiled in an embarrassed fashion. Of course, I mean you, he said. Why, of course? Sam asked, and Mrs. Green nodded vigorously. Why not we, Mr. Kirschner? Well, you see, I haven't sold goods at retail for so long, Max explained, that I really don't know how. Sam turned to Mrs. Green with a quick shrug. Was hast du gehört? He cried. You don't know how? If I wouldn't know how to sell goods the way you don't know how, Mr. Kirschner, I would quick build up a good business here. Tell me, Mr. Kirschner, how much longer do you got a vacation? Because I'd like to make you a proposition. You could stay with me here for the rest of your vacation, and I would give you half of the profits over the cost price of every garment you sell. How's that? Very generous, Max said. But you don't know what you're offering me, Green, because the vacation might last for several years. Several years? Sam repeated. You mean you retired from business, Mr. Kirschner? Exactly, Max answered, with a fortune of 2 diamond rings, a diamond pin, and $865 cash. Sam and Mrs. Green stared at him incredulously. In other words, Green, Max concluded, I have just been fired out of a job as traveling salesman which I held for 20 years, and I don't see a chance of getting another one." For a moment, Sam and his wife exchanged glances. "Mr. Kirshner," Sam said, "how much can you get for them diamonds?" $1,500, I guess," Max replied. "Then what's the use of talking nonsense, Mr. Kirshner?" Sam cried excitedly. "Come along with me over to the Farmers National Bank and we'll see Mr. Fuller. If he would renew my accommodation for $1,000, you and me would go as partners together and fertig." "Fuller?" Max cried. "That ain't Wilbur M. Fuller, is it?" "That's the one," Sam declared. "Then we'll not only get him to renew the accommodation, Sam, but we'll sell him some shirts and neckties as well. He and I clerked together in Van Buskirk and Patterson's." As a sequel to Max's visit to the Farmers National Bank, Abe and Mawruss waited in vain for the return of Sam's check. "How did you know the check wasn't good, Mawruss?" Abe asked his partner a week later. "I ain't said it ain't good, Abe," Mawruss protested. "I only seen Markson, which he works for Klinger & Klein as a bookkeeper in Hammersmith's today, and he says that Mo Greaseman goes around trying to buy up all Sam Green's bills payable, and he's got about $500 worth now already." "Sure, I know he did," Abe replied. "He got from Kleiman and Ellenbogen Sam's $350 debt for $275 cash, and Sam sends him a check for the full amount the day before yesterday. I seen Louis Kleiman yesterday, and he was feeling pretty sore, I bet you." Mawruss nodded. He had been completely mystified about Sam's affairs since the arrival of a letter from Cyprus addressed to Mawruss personally, wherein Sam repaid the money advanced for his hotel accommodation and announced that he had abandoned, for the present, his intention of returning to New York. Morris's mystification was hardly abated by the following letter, which arrived on the heels of the conversation above set forth. Samuel Green and Company, Dry Goods and Notions, the K&M Self-Shaped Corset, Cyprus, New York, May 1, 1910. Yours truly, Samuel Green and Company. P.S. You should telegraph Farmers National Bank for references if he ain't satisfied to ship without it. Business is good. S. Green. Gents, we enclose your herewith memorandum of order. Kindly ship same within 10 days by fast freight and oblige. Morris Perlmutter's relations with Sol Klinger retained their cordiality, despite the rupture between Abe Potash and Klinger & Klein. To be sure, Mo Greaseman's defection had rankled, but Morris consoled himself with the maxim, business is business. And when he met Sol Klinger in Hammersmith's restaurant during the first week of the spring buying season, he greeted Sol cordially. His friendly advance, however, was met with a decided rebuff. "What's the matter now, Sol?" Morris asked. Sol nodded his head slowly. "It's a great world, Morris," he said. Morris agreed with him. "There's business enough in it for everybody anyhow, Sol, if that's what you mean," he replied. "In lots of places, yes, but in others, no," Sol said. "But with some people, Morris, they're like a snake in the grass, which it bites the hand that feeds it." "What's Mo Klein been doing now?" Morris asked. "Mo Klein?" Sol cried. "What do you mean, Mo Klein? I ain't talking about Mo Klein at all. I'm talking about Max Kirshner, Morris. There's a fellow which we give him for 20 years. Good wages, Morris, and what do we get for it after he leaves us, Morris?" "Left you?" Morris interrupted. "Why, I always thought you fired him." "Sure we fired him," Sol continued. "A low-life bum which he makes always a hog of himself. Why shouldn't we fire him? And then, Morris, when we're talking on Mo Greaseman's nephew, Rabiner, what does that sucker Max Kirshner do? He turns around and fixes up with a fellow by the name Sam Green in Cyprus to go as partners together in Sam Green's store up there. And mind you, Morris, Mo Greaseman had just bought out Sam Green's competitors, Van Buskirk and Patterson, and Max Kirshner knows all the time that the only reason we took on Mozart Rabiner was on account of his uncle, Mo Greaseman." Sol Klinger was so interested in his own narrative that he completely failed to notice its effect on Morris Perlmutter, who sat with his jaw dropping lower and lower while great beads of perspiration stood on his forehead. "Yes, Morris," Saul continued. "Mo Greaseman even comes down himself from Syracuse to Cyprus to superintend things. $5,000 fixtures he puts in, and $40,000 he pays to them two yokels, Van Buskirk and Patterson, for the goodwill, stock, and store building. And what happens? For a whole month, Mo sits in that store, and not $100 worth of goods goes out of that place, Morris. And why? It seems that Sam Green and Max Kirshner does all the business, because Max Kirshner is born and raised in Cyprus and knows everybody in the place." "Max was born and raised in Cyprus?" Morris gasped. "That's what I said," Saul replied. "That's a Nachbar shot for a fellow to be born in, what?" Morris nodded and rose wearily to his feet. "I never could remember the name of that place even at all," he said. "Well, I guess now I'd be getting back to the store." "You got my permission," Saul said, as Morris started from the restaurant. These were destined to be the last words addressed to Morris by Saul Klinger in many a long day, for the moving incidents which awaited Morris's return to his showroom put an end to all friendship between him and Saul. Imprimis, when Morris entered, Mo Greaseman was seated in the firm's private office, the center of an animated group of four. "Hello there, Morris," Mo shouted. "There's a couple of gentlemen here which would like to talk to you." He indicated a ruddy, clean-shaven person of approximately 50 years, who on closer inspection proved to be Max Kirshner, shorn of his white mustache and without the attendant nimbus of his diamond pin. The other individual was even harder to identify, by reason of a neat-fitting business suit of brown and a general air of prosperity. But in him, Morris descried the person of what had once been Sam Green. "Morris, you old rascal," Max cried, "when you took me over to the Prince Clarence Hotel that day, why didn't you tell me that the man you wanted me to go into business with ran a store in Cyprus?" "I couldn't remember the name of the place at all," Morris admitted. Abe gazed at him sorrowfully. "The fact is, gentlemen," he said, "my partner ain't got no head at all." Sam Green's face flushed in recollection of the phrase. "Never mind," he said fervently. "He's got anyhow a heart." "And I've got a stomach," Max Kirshner added irrelevantly. "At least I've recovered one since I've been eating Leah Green's good cooking." Sam and Mo Greaseman smiled sympathetically. "Well, what's the use of wasting time here, boys?" Mo said at last. "Let's explain to Morris about the new combination. Me and Max and Sam Green here have agreed to go as partners together in Cyprus under the name the Cyprus Dry Goods Company. In a small town like Cyprus, competition is nix." "Good!" Morris exclaimed. "I'm glad to hear it. Is the Syracuse store included too?" "A 10% interest they got, although I'm going to run my Syracuse business and these here boys is going to run the Cyprus end," Mo continued. "And now, Abe, as Max has got to pick out a lot of goods for the Cyprus store, and I want to do the same for my Syracuse store. Let's get to work." For 3 hours, without cessation, they labored over Potash and Perlmutter's sample line, until garments to an amount in excess of $5,000 had been ordered. When Max Kirshner saw the total of Mo Greaseman's selection for the Syracuse store, he emitted a low whistle. "Say, Mo," he said, "ain't you going to give your nephew Rabiner any show at all this season?" "Ausser a shtick," Greaseman declared. "I've done enough for that fellow when I got him 3 years' contract with Klinger & Klein." End of section 7.